Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait a few more minutes for people to join. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and start? We have a great lineup of speakers today, and so we want to jump right in to make sure we have time to cover all of the stuff we want to cover. Welcome to the webinar, Israel-Palestine, U.S. Complicity and Accountability. In 2016, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA passed policy stating that the complicity of the Presbyterian Church USA and other U.S. Christians in enabling the continued Israeli occupation derives from the overwhelming support from the United States to Israel, regardless of its policies. And many of us are unaware of the extent to which we are complicit. Major organizations funding Israeli settlers who are committing human rights violations by destroying Palestinians' homes and communities have charitable 501c3 status in the United States. That over 30 states have passed legislation designed to penalize individuals and companies that choose to boycott Israel due to its human rights record. And that US taxpayers will give Israel $38 billion in unconditional military aid over a 10-year period, despite its human rights violation, which is in violations of our own laws that state that all countries receiving US aid must meet some human rights standards. Today, we will discuss these issues with people in the forefront of organizing on the ground in Israel-Palestine, as well as those engaged in legal and advocacy efforts here in the US. Today, joining us are Sami Hourani, a political activist and community organizer based in Palestine. He co-founded Youth of Samud, a nonviolent resistance movement that provides material support for marginalized communities facing settler violence across the West Bank. Youth of Samud spearheaded the efforts to return a Palestinian presence to this displaced community of Sarura after it had been abandoned for over 20 years. Sami has also been involved in protecting Palestinian civilians from settler attacks by escorting Palestinian children to school and accompanying Palestinian farmers to their lands close to the Green Line. Cody O'Rourke is a member of the Good Shepherd Collective, a collective based in Palestine that builds advocacy and communication structures with Palestinian communities to advance the vision of a free Palestine. Diala Shamas is a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she works on challenging government and law enforcement abuses perpetrated under the guise of national security, both in the US and abroad. Ms. Shamas often represents human rights defenders, including advocates for Palestinian rights, who are targeted for their work by both private and state actors. She received her law degree from Yale Law School and has taught at Stanford Law School and City of University of New York School of Law. Laura Friedman is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. With more than 25 years working in the Middle East foreign policy arena, Laura is a leading authority on US foreign policy in the Middle East, with particular expertise on the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of the US Congress. In addition to her work at Foundation for Middle East Peace, Laura is a contributing writer at Jewish Currents and a non-resident fellow at the US Middle East Project. Prior to joining Foundation for Middle East Peace, Lara was the Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. And before that, she was U.S. Foreign Service Officer serving in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. So we are going to take questions at the end, but if you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A. So Sammy and Cody will be giving a sense of what's going on the ground. And they have a short, we're going to watch the beginning of a short video. We'll put the link to the complete video in the chat. And this is a video that the Good Shepherd Collective worked on with AJ+.
What are Americans doing at a scene like this from occupied East Jerusalem? In exclusive footage obtained by AJ+, you're watching a group of Americans build a fence outside one Palestinian family's home in Sheikh Jarrah.
Smile, smile.
And they were hired to do it by the founder of a US registered charity.
Where are you from? Why are you doing this? Understand what you are doing.
In the last decade, US charities have funneled millions of dollars to settler groups, and these donations are tax deductible, meaning Americans are effectively subsidizing settlement activity, which is considered illegal under international law. Now, Palestinians are appealing to people in the US to stop funding their oppression. And that call is being answered.
And just as they are not welcome in Palestine, they are not welcome in New York City!
As the families impacted wage a relentless battle to stay in their homes. For now, their fate remains undecided. In this report for AJ+, we explore the links between the settler movement in Israel, charitable giving in the US.
Just one question, Rabbi, please.
And the people who are participating in it.
What's a guy from Virginia doing building a fence around a Palestinian family's home?
This is Sheikh Jarrah, a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem that was occupied by Israel in 1967. It's against international law to push Palestinians out of this area, but that hasn't stopped settlers from using Israeli courts to do just that.
You are stealing my house!
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one!
The viral video of the Al-Kurd family confronting Jacob the settler is a crude example of how an American from Long Island could be directly involved in efforts to remove people from their homes.
This is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? What are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
And he's not alone. AJ+ is following attempts to evict another family from Sheikh Jarrah, and what we found is a network of Israeli settlers tied to charity donations from abroad and Americans themselves who are connected to efforts to displace the Salem family. The Salems have lived in this home for over 70 years. 11 family members live under this roof, and the head of the household, Fatima, was born here.
دار امي وابوي عشت معهم ربيت معهم كبرت هون تجوزت هون صارت هون انا وجبت ولادي خليل وايوب وبنات.
Of the 200 families living in this neighborhood, at least 93 are facing eviction, according to the Israeli NGO Peace Now.
مش راح نطلع من مرة هينا قاعدين هون ان هم يجوا يطلعونا بدخل لهم من فوق الباب. لو بقتلوني هون ما بترك داري هاي داري.
In early December.
Thank you. So Sammy and Cody, give us an idea of what we just saw, what and the work that you're doing right now.
Hi everyone. I really would like to thank you all for being here today to listen to our presentation. First thing, really, I would like to go to the certain situation on the ground and the place that I come from and all what we are facing in these days, and then we will move to Cody and we will talk more about the campaign and about the defund racism and what we saw in video. So I come from an area it's called Masafir Yatta, which is located in the south of the West Bank on the Green Line, south border with 48. After 1967, in the 70s, Israel started to declare Palestinian lands in West Bank as a firing zone area. Especially my area of Masafir Yatta, more than 35 dunums was declared as a firing zone area to train the Israeli military inside. Like especially with this excuse of firing zone area targeting the area exactly where Palestinians are living, like in villages like Masafir Yatta. After that, like my area was declared in the 70s as a firing zone area, then moved to the 80s when the Israelis start practically to practice this declaration that they declared in the 70s, and started in the end of the 99 and the beginning of 2000 to commit a war crime to evict our people from our land and transfer them to another place. A war crime was committed in the 99 and people were transported in Israeli military trucks and thrown in another place out of their homes and out of their land. But after the 99 and the beginning of 2000, of 3 months, the Palestinians were able to come back to their land and to their villages. But it's called with a temporary decision until there will be a new decision until there will be a new decision to stop this eviction. And since the 2000 and until few days ago, the Israeli military Supreme Court has declared the decision of the case of Masafir Yatta, and the decision is to evict the Palestinians again from their land and from their homes and their villages. And the excuse of the Israeli military in this case is that the Palestinians who are living in Masafir Yatta, people who are living temporary in this place and that they never lived there all their time. They have a lot of claims, and this is one of the claims. Beside of all the evidences that the Palestinian has brought to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court didn't care anything about all of these evidences that the Palestinian brought. But this is how it goes, that when we say there is no justice under occupation, so that's what we mean with the meaning of the word, that there is no justice under the occupation. They care at all about what we brought and what we have done, and they decided to evict the Palestinian in Masafir Yatta. So at the moment we are in an emergency situation, which means that at any moment, maybe tonight, tomorrow, after tomorrow, in 1 week, Israeli will start with the process of eviction and transferring Palestinian out of the communities and out of the villages of Masafir Yatta. To go back, how the same judge who declared this decision is a settler living in a settlement, and his name is Nis. So that's why I'm saying about how it's this eviction policy is a big part of the settler colonization of Palestine, and how it's not a matter about firing zone area, but it's a matter how to evict Palestinian under this excuse, and to steal and to confiscate more and more Palestinian land and Palestinian territories. Also when Israel in the 70s declared the firing zone area in the West Bank, it represents around 18% of the measurement of the West Bank, which is more than the measurements of area A in the West Bank. Masafir Yatta as well, it's considered area C. If you know what is, maybe most of you know what is the Oslo Accord. Area A is under full Palestinian control. Area B is mixed control, and Area C, which is full under Israeli military control. Masafir Yatta is considered Area C. Area C in general in Palestine represent more than 60%. I said this before. So first thing, that's my area considered with Area C. Especially, I want to talk also about the Palestinians who are living in Area C and what is the condition of life that they are living. It's completely the full apartheid system is applied on the Palestinians who are living in Area C. Everything regard of services, main services of life for Palestinians to reach is forbidden and is illegal according to the Israeli military law, which is the apartheid law. We're talking about road, we are talking about water network, we are talking about electricity, we are talking about healthcare and center. Everything if is implemented in Area C is illegal and immediately usually face the demolishing and the destruction by occupation authorities. So on Palestinian in my area is not just facing the firing zone challenge, but the other side we are facing is the settlements, which was as well mainly started in the beginning of the 80s. Establishing all this settlement along a highway was established by the Israeli government, occupation government. This settlement, they started with few main settlement, which is kind of like Ma'on, like I don't know, Karmael, which is like one of them is Ma'on, which is next to my village. We are talking about 100 meters far from my house and this settlement. This is the main one where when they were established by the beginning of the 80s, but in the beginning of the 2000s, there was the new outpost that showed up that this settlement are trying to build as well a kind of a wall of a settlement along with this highway that's called 317. So on, so the area is completely separated two parts. Part is declared as a firing zone area, and the other part is targeted by settlements and by settler as well facing settler violence and settler harassment. So both of these policies of firing zone and settlement are the main goal is to confiscate Palestinian land and to create a weather of trauma, to evict the Palestinian away from his land and to confiscate the Palestinian land and push Palestinian to Area A and to Area B and surround all Palestinians in these areas of A and B. Moving slowly to the beginning of 2000, the outposts started to show up. When we talk about settlements are considered illegal according as well to the international law. Both outposts and settlement are considered illegal according to the international law, but even the outposts are for the Israeli law are considered illegal, but they continue to exist and doesn't face any troubles. But Palestinians who are living in the land from hundreds of years, they are forbidden from anything, but the settlement and the settler who are built illegally on Palestinian land are always provided with all the needs and all the services they want. So this is as well very clear image where I live, and apartheid exists every day and every minute and every second. When we talk about what is the settler are carrying out from settler violence, reaching our houses, burning our caves, our fields, destroying our trees, beside all of this violent against us, physical violence direct to us as an activist, which we are daily in the field, documenting all of these attacks, organizing a lot of activities of demonstration against occupation and against the settler violence and against the oppression that we live in general. Despite all what we face from this violence of the settler on the ground, still the settlers, especially through Ragavim, are doing this pressure of on the courts and in the Israeli courts to continue to push and to raise the demolishing of Palestinian homes in my area. For example, they continue usually to fly the drones and controlling all the building that we are implementing in our land and our area to push in the Israeli soldier and the Israeli army and the Israeli courts to demolish all these Palestinian homes and structure. And Ragavim is playing a big role in pushing to the decision of the eviction of Masafer Yatta, and that's where we are now. And all of this work of lawyers of Ragavim and all of these efforts that they are doing is funded by the US charities dollars, which is completely used for oppression and for apartheid and for racism against against us as a Palestinian that living under the occupation. So it's another way how they are pushing and how they are using this this U.S. donation to evict us from our land, ethnically cleanse us from our land, and to take over our land. We reject all of these plans, and we reject all of these policies and what's happening, and we call for really urgent call for the international community, first of all, to intervene for preventing the crime that's going to happen soon in Masafar Yatta. We are people that we are owning this land, and we will never leave our land, and we are organizing several actions and activities on the ground against these decisions. And as well, we are here to tell you as people, to stop funding and supporting the racist settlers organization against us, and from supporting them, and stop supporting them from stealing our land and kicking out Palestinians from their land. And I think I took longer than my time. Sorry. Go ahead, Cody.
Yeah, so my name's Cody. Again, I'm with the Good Shepherd Collective. Sammy had said a lot of stuff, trying to cram in a lot in a short period of time. But I think that the key things of what Sammy was highlighting is, the violence that happens in their communities. It comes from very specific sources. So in his community of South Hebron, there's an organization that's called Regavim. And this organization is a settler organization. Their objective is to push Palestinians off of their land so it can be developed, for the Israeli state. And so in the case that's in the news right now, in the 918 firing zone, when several communities are about ready to be displaced, we see that it's actually Regavim, this organization that's pushing the Israeli state to evict these communities. So, what the Good Shepherd Collective and Youth of Samud and Sami and other communities that were at risk of displacement, we wanted to organize a campaign that targeted the funds of these settler organizations. So we see that these settler organizations really operate not only in the West Bank, but they operate in East Jerusalem, like you saw in the video in Sheikh Jarrah. They operate in the Naqab, which is the southern part of historical Palestine. They operate in the occupied areas in the north, in the Syrian Golan Heights. So in very real ways, these settler organizations, they're not just operating inside of the West Bank, but they're operating, across the board. So when we talked to Palestinian communities and what they felt was the most urgent campaign to push forward, for them, it's the organizations that are taking them to court. It's the people that you saw in the video that were beating on their doors trying to evict them. For these Palestinian communities, these organizations really represent the tip of the spear of the violence and the displacement that they're facing. So with that being the case, we went to dozens of communities to have this call to ask people to challenge the legal structures in their home communities that allow for charities to pass money onto these organizations. So this is another form of nonviolent resistance that Palestinians wanted to take up the challenge, their oppressors. So while this campaign is taking shape, in various ways in Canada and the UK and elsewhere, for this US audience, the way that the campaign to defund racism has been taking shape is asking individuals within inside of their states to identify the foundations that are giving money to these organizations. And I'll list them, put them on the website. But we're asking people in their individual state to approach their state attorneys general and to ask them to investigate these charities and to ensure that these charities are fulfilling their charitable obligations, that they're not breaking the law by financing violence.
Great, thank you, Cody. I feel like each one of these speakers we could spend a whole hour with on these issues. They're such important issues, and we're covering them very quickly. But we wanted to give people a sense of how many ways the U.S. is complicit in this, and we're really grateful for the two of you. You are doing really brave work, and we're thankful that you took time out of your busy schedule to be with us today, and we really appreciate it. Now we're going to move on to Diala Shamas, who is going to speak to us about the legal issues within the U.S. and how the U.S. is suppressing nonviolent resistance to these human rights violations.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and to Sammy and Cody for grounding us in the situation in Misafiriyata, which is, currently one of the most urgent situations, and where we've really seen the sharpest edge, or the tip of the spear, as you said, of the settler movement, and has been for a long time. So I am going to shift gears a little bit, and there are sort of two facets of the kind of assistance that the U.S. government and U.S. actors are offering to the Israeli settler movement and to the Israeli state, right? So first there's the sort of official material support and foreign assistance that the U.S. government and private individuals are offering or are sending over to the Israeli government. Also the kinds of assistance through private actors, the 501c3s that Cody highlighted. And please definitely check out the Defund Racism website that was dropped in the chat for more details about some of those, and naming them is really important. And I think Lara will speak a little bit more about the kind of official forms of support. But we also have a different facet, which is assistance in the form of suppression of advocates and human rights defenders, right? So tying the hands of those of us who seek to advocate for Palestinian rights. So while we're trying to focus on the perpetrators of the attacks, right? These groups, these foundations, these state actors, like the settlers on the ground also, or their funders, advocates and Palestinians on the ground are struggling to defend themselves, right? In Palestine, that's really concretely through actual physical attacks and assaults, through the designation as terrorists by the Israeli state, through other forms of retaliation. But in the U.S., it's also happening in different forms, and it's a little bit different. And it's both been through U.S. action and U.S. inaction. And I'll focus my comments on this aspect of U.S. assistance, because silencing criticism of human rights violations is just as powerful as actively supporting human rights violations. So the current situation is one where Palestinian rights advocates seeking to highlight the injustices that Palestinians face, or even who seek to make basic human rights or law-based arguments or talk about their lived experiences like Sami did, have had to deviate all of their resources in order to defend themselves instead of doing that, right? So these attacks have taken, these attacks have taken several forms, and increasingly through vicious smear campaigns. I think Lara will cover some of the legislation, the ways that this has played out through legislation. But there's also been sort of legal attacks through US courts. So I think everyone is probably familiar with the smear campaigns. These typically deploy two major frames, either accusing Palestinian supporters of supporting terrorism or accusing them of being anti-Semitic or racist or discriminatory. And the ADL's Jonathan Greenblatt has recently publicly stated, has recently kind of taken this step further than they even have historically for that kind of a mainstream organization. Just last weekend, he called the radical left a priority for that organization, just as important to go after as white supremacists and actual anti-Semites. And he named organizations like Jewish for Peace and SJP as like in the sort of target that they were going to be targeting these kinds of organizations, right, through all of the available channels, including legal ones. So this is pretty serious. Normally, I would not want to spend time on a webinar like this and give airtime to, you know, when we want to be talking about a situation on the ground, we don't want to be giving airtime to these kinds of attacks and these smear campaigns. But unfortunately, we're in a situation where audiences like this one, who want to support Palestinian rights, are likely to encounter these kinds of attacks. And it's important to understand that they are part of a very deliberate campaign. And so it's crucial that we hold our representatives, our institutions, our politicians accountable to not be amplifying this kinds of framing and sort of, apologies for the sirens outside, and not be amplifying these kinds of attacks. So whether that's happening in interfaith circles or in social justice circles, you know, it's important to not allow these kinds of smear campaigns like the ones that the ADL is actively engaging in, going after Palestinians and undermining them, to go unanswered. And I just want to drop one link in the chat. One response to this has been social justice groups in the US have come together around a campaign. They call it the Drop the ADL campaign, which really to highlight the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League's role in a lot of these kinds of attacks and efforts to undermine Palestinian rights advocacy, and you know, encourage folks to check that out on their time. But I also wanted to offer a few examples of the ways these two lines of attack, so the anti-Semitism attack and the terrorism attack, have played out in American courts really briefly, because this is what I know best as a lawyer in this space. What we see is the abuse of US laws that are intended to protect vulnerable populations, victims of discrimination, and turning them on their heads and use them against vulnerable Palestinian populations, in this case Palestinians, or human rights advocates. And two really brief examples, just to sort of offer an illustration. One is, some of you might recall that Airbnb, the platform, had once taken a decision to remove, very simply, the properties that are listed in these settlements, right? So places like Maon, you know, places in Masafer Yatta or in the Nablus area or all over East Jerusalem, these settler or individuals and organizations will just rent some of their properties on Airbnb. Airbnb had decided to no longer allow them to list those properties. It was a pretty basic step. It was rooted in international law obligations. And what happens, predictably, they get incredible amounts of pushback, including in the form of lawsuits. The lawsuit that I'm most familiar with is ironically one where a group, these settlers, you know, these, you know, extremists who are squatting on Palestinian land, use the Fair Housing Act, the US Civil Rights Statute, to sue Airbnb in US federal court. And so that's just to give you a sense of how these things get turned on their heads and how anti-discrimination language just gets utilized and weaponized against, in this case, not even Palestinian advocates, but a mainstream corporation that was taking a really measured step that was sort of baseline what we expect, which is to not actively support settlement economies. Another example, and this was to highlight the terrorism framework, we represent the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. This is a DC-based nonprofit that supports Palestinian rights. And in November 2019, the Jewish National Fund, or Keren Kayemet LeYisrael, which is an Israeli organization, sued the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights under using the US material support to terrorism laws. And they make these outlandish claims in their lawsuit. It's a 60-page complaint. And they basically argue that the US campaign's support for the Boycott National Committee, which is based in Palestine, renders them liable for material support to terrorism through an elaborate and implausible set of allegations that are frankly not really worth getting into. But among the things that they cite to support their allegations are things like the US campaign's expressions of support for the right to return, right of Palestinian refugees to return, or the US campaign's opposition to the Israeli use of force against Palestinian protesters who were marching during the Great Return March in Gaza. So these kinds of lawsuits are intended to bog down the resources of the movement, to deviate the attention away from the issues on the ground that we want to be focusing on. Just as a note, the judge ruled in our favor, dismissed the lawsuits against the US campaign, finding the claims implausible, and the Jewish National Fund is now appealing the case because the purpose again here is to exhaust resources and to turn the attention away. So it's not just through the courts, and I'm gonna end here, but I also just wanna highlight that US overbroad counterterrorism laws are also being hijacked by Israeli actors. And so here I want to end with just reminding folks that 6 major Palestinian civil rights organizations, human rights organizations, civil society organizations have been designated by Israel as terrorist organizations. And so one would be tempted to say, well, that's something that Israel did and the US has nothing to do with it, but that's wrong. The US, through its inaction, allows the Israelis to effectively hijack our legal system and our administrative systems to silence these organizations, right? So by not affirmatively distancing ourselves and saying that these designations are unfounded and are baseless, US banks, US social media platforms, financial institutions, all sorts of private actors are going to pull back from these Palestinian organizations who are being accused of being affiliated with terrorists and are essentially going to silence them, right? Because we have a system where the terrorism war sucks the air out of the room, and it essentially makes anybody who's accused of terrorism sort of radioactive. And this is a really dangerous feature of how these attacks have played out and how we've allowed our system to sort of be used in all sorts of ways. And so it's important to kind of be aware of it, push back against it, and just remember that in addition to actively supporting the occupation through official policies, through 501c3s, we're also just through our silence allowing all sorts of platforms for Israeli settler organizations and Israeli right-wing groups to kind of take control of the conversation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Diala. That was really informative and really sort of lifting the veil on all of this activity that is going on that we don't pay attention to on a regular basis and is sort of hidden from us in the noise. And two of those organizations that were recently labeled terrorists by the Israeli government are partners of the Presbyterian Church, Defense for Children International Palestine, and also Al-Haq, which is a historic human rights Palestinian organization that's been in effect since the 1970s. So thank you. Now we'll move on to Lara, who will give us a sense of the official US policy and also what that means in the big picture.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to Diala and Sami and Cody for really laying out the facts, I think, incredibly clearly and powerfully. I was asked to talk about big picture, and I've got 8 minutes, so I think I'm going to be kind of like speaking in as briefly as I can about a lot of things.
You have 10.
Oh, 10 minutes. Okay, so I can speak briefly about a few more things. Look, for me, I think of this section a little bit as I'm talking to an American audience. So why does all of this matter to me, right? If I'm not Palestinian, maybe, or I'm not like living in Israel, Palestine, why does this matter? And the fact is that it does matter. And this is a matter, I want to talk here about the US policy. Again, we're talking about the administration, Congress, but also in states. And I first want to say something that is, I think, maybe encouraging, both encouraging and also challenging, which is, people talk about the Overton window moving, right? That idea of what is allowed in the mainstream discourse. They talk about it moving on various issues. In Israel-Palestine, the Israel-Palestine issue in the US, that Overton window is under actual dispute. There is a push-pull going on in real time. And that's not new, right? It's always been a politicized issue. There's always been people who wanted to shut down debate. There's always been people who felt strongly one side or the other and tried to have it be an issue in elections or whatever else. But it's different today, right? This is in dispute in a way as never before. And in some ways, it suggests that everyone recognizes that there are changes afoot. So from the side of folks who for years have not wanted Israel to be criticized, have been wanted the US to line up with everything Israel does, no matter what it is, they are feeling simultaneously under greater pressure to defend that position, because in the absence of any Israeli interest in a peace process, and in the presence of Israeli policies on the ground, like declaring that they're, the High Court declaring that they can uproot 1,000 people in the South Hebron Hills and they don't have to worry about international law, it gets harder and harder, right, to defend Israel from criticism, which means you got to quash the criticism. That's critical. Whether you do it by calling it anti-Semitic or support for terror, as Diallo was saying, you're at the zero sum. We can't defend it, so we can't allow it. So that's the push. On the other hand, they recognize that there is a strong pull coming on that Overton window from a grassroots in the United States that has moved, and polling makes it very clear that it has moved. Some of that movement is generational. Some of that movement is political in terms of a reawakening of a progressive movement in the United States, whether that's because of Trump or some of the same forces that led to Trump. You look at polling now, including like really interesting polling that came out a couple weeks ago from the American Jewish Committee, which is an organization that is very much on the side of trying to push the Overton window to quashing all criticism of Israel by saying it's anti-Semitic. They did polling of Jewish millennials, which basically showed that most Jewish millennials disagree with the American Jewish Committee on the assertion that there's raging anti-Semitism taking over US campuses and that has to be shut down. It's fascinating. Their own polling didn't bear it out. So that push-pull, I think, is very much at the root of what we're seeing today. Big picture, it's affecting every aspect. It's intruding into every aspect of US politics. If you start at the highest level with the administration, the Biden administration came in saying they were going to undo Trump. And on Israel-Palestine, they specifically said they were going to change, they're going to roll back some of the things that the grassroots progressives certainly thought that Trump had done wrong, like closing down the consulate in Jerusalem, like shutting down the PLO mission in Washington, like cutting off aid to humanitarian aid, NGO aid to Palestinians. And they came in and they've done very little of that, right? So there's some aid that's flowing, funding to UNRWA started, that's important on an individual basis, on humanitarian basis, that's fine. But let's remember, Israel is perfectly happy to have the international community engage with the Palestinians as a humanitarian issue, as long as you don't touch the politics. In terms of the politics, the Biden administration has run scared when it came to actually rolling back policies like, you know, they said they'd reopen the consulate. They haven't. They haven't reopened a US mission for the Palestinians in Washington. They haven't in any significant way changed gone back to opposing settlements. Like, let's talk about what it means, you know, when we have last week the court decision in Israel to allow for the ethnic cleansing of more than 1,000 Palestinians in the South Hebron Hills, followed by the announcement of 4,000 new settlement units being approved for the West Bank. The reason for that, ostensibly rationale, is as collective punishment for a terror attack inside Israel. You announce both of those things. The administration, the Biden administration, offers almost pro forma objections of strongly objects, but also makes absolutely clear there will be no accountability. There will be no consequences. Biden's still coming. I mean, no accountability, no consequences is a green light. Let's be really clear. That's how Israel interprets it. That's how Bibi interpreted it. And they're not wrong. The idea that Israel would change its policy in the face of no accountability, that would be irrational on the part of Israel. So that's the administration. In Congress, this issue has been weaponized as never before. It's not new that this is used as a weapon in Congress, but if you go back, starting with the rise of the so-called squad, where you start to see voices willing to express solidarity with Palestinians, willing to defend and sometimes articulate a perspective that reflects Palestinian experiences, and you see this denounced. Again, it's the anti-Semitism and the terrorism side by side. We're going to use those as weapons. And you see progressives or the legacy political forces on the left joining in, which is, I think, what has been the most astounding for a lot of us. And you know, you see Democrats joining and attacking other Democrats for effectively not being pro-Israel enough, and in the process, legitimizing and sharpening a weapon that's being used against progressives more broadly, right? And we're seeing that now in an election cycle. I tweeted this morning about the rallying against, we have a progressive Jewish Democrat. I mean, I'm not endorsing anybody, but I mean, just looking at how this is playing in races, a progressive Jewish Democrat in Michigan, who is part of a Jewish political family for years. And effectively, the legacy Jewish organizations in this country are rallying against him in support of a non-Jewish progressive candidate who may be fabulous. I don't know anything about her, but they're rallying against him because they consider him not sufficiently pro-Israel. And if you look at the article today from the former head of the ADL, who's actually suggesting he isn't trustworthy on anti-Semitism either, because he doesn't rally against his colleagues who are defending Palestinians. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary escalation in this issue. But again, I think it speaks as much to a fear of the changes in the grassroots as it does to a sense of we can win this. So there's good and bad news. The last piece is the state level. And Diala talked about some of the things happening in terms of quashing free speech. The other piece of it, and Diala, I've learned most of this at the feet of Diala and colleagues at Palestine Legal who do an extraordinary job. And if there's one thing you take away from this webinar in terms of US work, is that you should be following and supporting groups like CCR and Palestine Legal who do unbelievable work. At the state level, again, with this push-pull on the Overton window, at the point when I think on both sides, politicians who are pro-Israel, defined to mean pro-Greater Israel, anti-Palestinian. The idea that you can't win the argument, whether it's the argument over settlements. We started this event talking about settlements. When people talk about anti-BDS legislation, which is what's happening at states, it's important to realize that anti-BDS legislation is first and foremost about preventing people from differentiating between Israel and settlements, which is what we saw with Airbnb and Ben & Jerry's. This is legislation that explicitly defines Israel to mean Israel plus settlements, and then defines any action to boycott or differentiate between them as BDS, and all of it beyond the pale. So we have this movement across US states, and it's a movement, if I would encourage people, someone put in the chat saying about the movie Boycott, you should watch the movie Boycott. One of the things that movie highlights for you is that this is not something that is coming from a grassroots in these states. It is coming from organizations that have an agenda that they're pushing across the country. And let's go back to when I started, what does this have to do with me? I've saying this for years, and I think I'll probably end here because I think I'm running out of time. For folks who maybe don't feel like they need to focus so much on Israel-Palestine, I've been saying for years, and Palestine Legal and CCR know this better than anyone, if you start giving a kosher stamp for laws that erode the right to protest, that erode free speech, it starts on Israel-Palestine, it doesn't end in Israel-Palestine. So today, I will say I spend as much time tracking what I call anti-BDS copycat laws as I do following the anti-BDS and the faux anti-Semitism laws, which are the laws trying to legislate a definition of anti-Semitism, which would basically make almost any criticism of Israel considered anti-Semitic if you don't criticize every other country in the world doing anything bad at the same time. And today, I mean, I don't know where the overall overarching value system is for every single person on this call, but I would think that it would be a wake-up call when you realize that in the name of defending Israel, for a very specific idea of what it means to defend Israel, we are now seeing in the US a trend towards delegitimizing all human rights monitoring. We can't have human rights organizations that hold Israel to the same standard as the rest of the world. Therefore, we have to, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, we must call all of them beyond the pale, radioactive. We cannot have human rights monitoring unless there's an Israel exception. If you look at things like ESG, the idea that there should be in economic policies, investment policies that are informed by values, there is now a national campaign to shut down ESG, to bar it by law in states. And it's based on anti-BDS laws, and it's supported by many of the same legal arguments and legal forces that were behind anti-BDS laws, because they've always recognized, and you can look at the work of groups like Zohar Legal, they've always recognized that if an opening is given to allow things like human rights and international law to be considerations when people are giving advice on how you should invest, that's not going to go well for Israel, right? So we can't let it happen at all. So this is the metastasizing, and it is a real issue. And it's something that I will say, when I think about like what people can be doing, this is the educating yourselves. And I don't believe in hope as a strategy for anything, but maybe the awakening for people more broadly, even if you're maybe not super focused on Israel-Palestine, the awakening that this is going to come for your free speech, for your right to protest on a whole range of issues. It's coming for the ability to advocate for human rights in Ukraine, for the Uyghurs, for anybody. If Human Rights Watch and Amnesty cannot operate because they're not allowed to talk about Israel, they're not going to be allowed to operate at all. And that's going to have implications beyond. So that's the big picture. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks. And I believe one of the cases that's featured in the movie Boycott, I put the link in the chat. Two of the cases were settled and found this anti-boycott legislation to be anti-constitutional, but one of the cases is still in the works. And this is a case that was brought by a libertarian guy from Arkansas who didn't understand why he, running a newspaper, why in Arkansas, he would have to sign a statement saying that he would not boycott Israel. And I believe it's still moving towards the Supreme Court. And so and that's both good and bad in terms of challenging the law, but what if the Supreme Court, upholds these laws? Then we are, the right to boycott anything, as Laura is saying, is at risk. So thank you. And people are asking how to a link to the news that Laura is sharing. I recommend following her on Twitter, and also the Foundation for Middle East Peace website, fmep.org. Great, so let's move to questions. I believe there was a question about criticism of hurled against both Palestinians and Israelis, that they're exaggerations. I don't know if any of you want to address that, that there are exaggerations and slurs being hurled at both Palestinians and Israelis.
I'm not sure if this is what the question is getting at, but if it is, just to clarify that Israeli left-wing organizations are also being accused of supporting terrorism and of being anti-Semitic, then that's absolutely true. In addition to, of course, Jewish American organizations that are being accused of being anti-Semitic. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, just offering that.
Thank you. There's another question about making the US Secretary of State follow US policy. I believe that that's referencing the our laws on military restrictions or conditioning on military aid in terms of human rights. What would be the mechanisms for us to have an effect on that?
I'll just weigh in briefly. Look, the bottom line is our aid to Israel is unconditional. And that is, it's not just that it is in effect unconditional, we're describing how it looks. We're describing that as a matter of policy. Members of Congress want, they come out, they want to come out and say it is unconditional, right? That's considered part of the framing. And if you don't agree in the framing that's unconditional, then you're a problem. And I think fundamentally that's what the grassroots is pushing back on. The argument that the administration is out of compliance with the law doesn't really work because they're in compliance with what Congress wants, A. B, when we talk about human rights requirements on military aid, it gets a little squishy. People, I think, generally are talking about the Leahy law. And the bottom line is the Leahy law is not, it's hard to see how, I mean, one could see really wanted Israel to be held to account, they could try to find a way to say the Leahy law should be applied. But the Leahy law is about specific aid to specific elements and specific projects in a military, right? Which works with other countries, because with other countries, the US controls the aid that we give. We control exactly how it's dispersed on an ongoing basis. We know who's getting it and how they're using it. With Israel, we give them cash. It simply doesn't apply in the same way. It could be made to apply. But it sort of feels like when for years I remember people say to me, well, why, what can we do to force the US to comply with its settlement policy? And I feel like there's a misunderstanding of what it means when we talk about a government's policy. The government's policy is what it does. It's not, we can hold you account because somebody said something in a speech. What they do is their policy.
So people are asking about the specific names of the organizations that are supporting settlements that are tax exempt. Cody, would you have those?
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to put the link to the website. They're listed right on the front of the website very clearly. But to name them again, it's Regavim, the Hebron Fund, the Israel Land Fund, Alad, which is the city of David, as well as Ateret Kohanim.
And might I just add?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the ones that Cody just listed out are the Israeli organizations, but they have U.S. counterparts. And so one group that has been very publicly reported on is called the Central Fund of Israel. It's probably not an organization that any of you have heard about because it has this really benign sounding name, but they are they're one of the major funders in the space, funding, I think probably all of the groups that Cody listed. And in terms of listing resources also, Fidelity is an American major donor advised fund. And there's been a group of, there's folks on this call who are in Boston, in the Boston area. There's a Fidelity campaign called the Unmasking Fidelity Campaign. And they, are looking at all of the organizations that donor advised fund has been supporting, and Central Fund of Israel has been receiving tens of millions a year from Fidelity. So there's a sort of public pressure campaign if folks want to plug into that with some really excellent organizations that are leading it locally. So check it out. And it's important to note that they're not just focusing on settler organizations receiving money, but also some other Islamophobic organizations, white supremacist groups, anti-immigrants rights groups. So really kind of looking at these sort of what we want to be doing with our charitable money, and like having this conversation and really engaging the sector in this way that, I think a lot of people get uncomfortable with, but it's also, I think, an important conversation to have because we're talking about such, I mean, in the case of settlements, like illegal activity.
Is this Fidelity Investments?
Yeah, donor advised funds. Probably most profits receive some money from Fidelity Investments. I mean, it's a donor advised fund. I can post a link in the chat right now for the
I believe we have our retirement funds through that in the PCUSA. So maybe and it's a new thing we can get active about. Somebody is asking about Christian Zionist organizations that are also participating in settlement support. I know there's Christians United for Israel. Are there others that anyone is aware of?
Yeah, I subscribe to almost all of them. My inbox is a lot of fun. Look, the evangelical Christian Zionist piece of this is huge. And this isn't just people funding groups. It's the proclaiming justice to the nations. It's the groups that take members of Congress out to visit quote unquote Judea and Samaria and build ties. And those members of Congress come back and introduce legislation related to supporting settlements, supporting Greater Israel. It is at this point there really is. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say there's an industry in evangelical America, which is, sending people out. I got an email from one of the evangelical lists I'm on. I use Evangelical Zionist List, which is a program where you can do your summer vacation volunteering in settlements in the West Bank. It's an application process to volunteer to spend your summer vacation working in a settlement, picking grapes or digging ditches. It's not a matter of a couple of organizations. It's a matter of a huge number of organizations. And grassroots fundraising at a massive level, and then grass tops donations at a high level. And I want to add the last piece. I know we're getting to the end of time. It's also looking at groups like the American Center for ACLJ, American Center for Law and Justice, the J. Sekla, the Messianic piece of it, to understand how powerful this is politically and how engaged they are. This is at the lawfare level, at the level of, FOIA-ing and suing parts of the government. It is this constant effort at many levels. And the what I call the philo-Semitism angle, philo-Semitism being what a lot of folks would like to say is the opposite of anti-Semitism. I think most progressive Jews would say philo-Semitism is another form of anti-Semitism. It is a fetishization of Jews in Israel. And it is embraced, just passionately by a lot of folks who it is there, it's up there with the other sort of the issues that touch the nerve the deepest at the grassroots level, whether it's reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, or philo-Semitism. And that is something that maybe, folks in this audience, know more about and can learn more about.
Thank you. It looks like we're at time. Thanks to all of you for this really informative, really amazing webinar. We really appreciate you taking times out of your busy schedule. I know you're all very busy doing very important work, and we're really grateful. Just one announcement before we go. We have 2 more webinars or 3 more webinars in this series. One is going to look at Palestinian children in detention, and the other one is going to look at voices of hope from the ground and some of the peace activists and youth activists on the ground in Israel, Palestine. So we hope we'll have more info on those later, but we hope you will stay tuned. And thanks again to everyone for joining us.